Good morning and welcome to today's show. I'm Jeff Rehmeyer and I'm here with my show Family Matters. Today we're talking again about protecting your family. Specifically, today we have a special guest and we will be focusing on issues related to students in college. So stay tuned to discover insights from the university level with regard to matters that might affect admissions and finances for your child. I'm Jeff Rehmeyer. I'm an attorney and president at the CGA law firm. Historically, my practice involved estate planning and administration, real estate, and business. Now, I'm focusing on estate planning to include planning for young adults. On today's show, we have Ryan Service Manzo. Ryan is the Director of Enrollment Services for Penn State York. So welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
So short background on Ryan has spent a lot of time supporting students at Penn State and a number of campuses. Currently the Director of Enrollment Services at Penn State York with a variety of duties, and we'll talk about that. Ryan also has been a graduate of Leadership Training Program at Leadership York. She's also been awarded an Excellence in Management programs, and by way of educational background, Ryan did graduate from Penn State University Park with a Master of Education in Higher Education and a minor in Counseling Education, and prior to that, Kent State University in Kent, Ohio. So Ryan, tell us for a few minutes about the career choices and how you got to where you are today, please.
Sure. Well, thank you all for joining, and thanks for inviting me to be a part today, Jeff. So, I guess that's a good question about how I found myself into higher education. I think when we talk to a lot of students and we're helping them navigate their career choices, I think very few, if any, come in and say they want to work in college admissions or maybe even be a college administrator. And so I think that was really my path as well, is just really thinking back to my own college experiences and how transformational it was for me to really just grow as a young person. And as I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to do with my life as I was proceeding through college, I just kind of kept gravitating back to higher education and wanting to provide the same opportunities for growth to students that I had as I was growing. And so that's really led me to ultimately pursue a master's in higher education. And then I was fortunate to get hired at one of Penn State's campuses, Penn State Berks in Reading, Pennsylvania, as my first job out of grad school. And so far, Penn State's kept me around, and now we're on almost 12 years. So happy to be here. I've had a wonderful career, and I've had the chance to work with both great colleagues and great students during those dozen or so years.
Great, Ryan. So two questions that popped into my head listening to you talk. One, and we've known each other for a few years now, but where were you born and what drew you to Kent State University in Ohio?
It's a good question, too. So I grew up out towards Pittsburgh. If anyone has heard of Arnold Palmer or Mr. Rogers or Ravy Rolling Rock, I grew up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. So definitely a Pennsylvanian born and bred, but on the other part of the state. And I looked at a lot of different colleges, but I was an active volleyball player in high school and had a tournament at Kent State and felt like it was a good distance from home. It was a good size. I remember looking at Penn State, and University Park was a little intimidating to me, a little bit too big, and none of the other campuses that were more local really spoke to me individually. So I ended up at Kent State and stayed there for, well, my entire baccalaureate degree, and then ran back home to Pennsylvania and have stayed since, although I had really a very wonderful experience at Kent State and wouldn't trade it for anything. But definitely at this point, I have to admit, I'm very much a Nittany Lion through and through.
That's excellent. So growing up in Latrobe, and one of my best friends grew up in Latrobe, Pittsburgh schools were a little too close, so that's why you bounced over to Ohio and then back all the way over to Penn State.
Yeah, I think that, and I talk to students a lot. I try, as I've now gotten a little too old to maybe say when I was in college, but I also like to talk with them about just the distance from home being an important factor. And for me, I wasn't really looking for an urban college experience now, and of course some are. So I think there's so many aspects to what a student's college choice is. Certainly things we typically will point out is size and location and the setting being some of the biggest factors to a student's choice about what's going to be the right fit for them.
Interesting. When I think about it, because I watch it with my kids and I have a lot of friends that have children going to school. So I like watching those choices. And at least for us based in Newark, I see a number of people stay locally, but I do see a lot favor Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, which I've seen happen in my family too. So although my daughter is happily entrenched at Penn State University Park in her last semester, enjoying it, but also being a little surprised that it's coming to a close. So I would also say that you can definitely reference when you're in college, Ryan, knowing the graduation dates that I do. So you're still good. So as the Director of Enrollment Services for Penn State York, can you tell us for a few minutes about what you do and what your function is on the campus?
Sure. And my role may be a bit unique just because of the way Penn State is structured as one university with 20 locations and a centralized admissions office that does a lot of the application processing. But a lot of my role, at least as I view it, is on the recruitment side. So promoting both the university at large and also the individual Penn State York campus to prospective students. Also, as part of a team on the admissions staff, managing, just helping students through that process as well, and navigating our different options. For those of you who are somewhat familiar with Penn State, we're a pretty complex university with both the number of majors and the campuses, as I just mentioned, and so a fair amount of our time is just devoted to helping students really navigate that. And then another part of my time, and I guess I should also add, is pretty cyclical, just depending on the time of year. Especially this time of year, I'm more focused on working with students who've applied to Penn State and specifically Penn State York and have an offer of admission, and working with them to finalize if we're the right choice for them. And so I devote more of my time to financial aid awarding, primarily around scholarships, which it's been an area of growth for me in my current job as I really grow up, if you will, and started my career on the admission side, and then become more familiar with the financial aid aspects of college, if you will, and in probably the last 6 years that I've been in this particular role.
Interesting. So if you look at the last 6 years in this role, what big changes have you seen in the higher education field in the last 5-6 years?
Yeah, that's I think about that a lot, and also, of course, thinking about what is yet to come. But there are a couple of themes that really jump out to me. Certainly, enrollment has gotten to be more challenging, to be blunt, for many colleges, and we're not really an exception to that. And the reason for that is, well, we've known that it's actually pretty interesting research that's been done that during economic recessions, usually families aren't having as many children. And believe it or not, if you think about the last major recession, not the most recent, but before that in 2008, we're actually coming up on a time period where we're about 18 years past that. And so we start to see a cliff of what the traditional age college students coming in the next few years. And so, but even before that, we've started to see a little bit of that decline. And so, so we're certainly very much impacted by, if there's less 17 and 18-year-olds coming, that's certainly going to impact our enrollment. And that's not exclusive to Penn State. That's really in many parts of the country, and that's pretty well documented as well. And then also we've seen pretty significant shifts in the demographics just within the state of Pennsylvania, which we're of course very sensitive to as well. And again, that's also fairly well documented. Pennsylvania, at least at one point, had the second oldest population in the state, next to Florida, or in the country. And so so that also has a pretty significant impact on Penn State. And The truth is in a lot of cases, families aren't having as many children as they used to, so there aren't as many children going on to colleges. And so that's been a shift that we've certainly have seen. And what that really results in is it's more competitive. We're
Mm-hmm.
colleges that we never saw in the surrounding area that are actively working to recruit students who are here. This area is actually fairly good in terms of the demographics, but a lot of the rest of the state isn't, especially in the northern part of the state. So that's certainly a trend that we've seen. We were also, of course, the pandemic had a huge impact for a lot of reasons. The first being in terms of enrollment. At Penn State York, at one point we had about 18% of our student population was international, and now that's less, I'd say around 3%, just because of the challenges to get into the country. And we're hoping that recovers, and we may start to see that a little bit now that we're hopefully moving to a better place there. But say over the last 2 years, that's been a pretty dramatic shift for us.
Wow. Okay. I think this question dovetails a little bit with what you just explained, but what has technology done to the student experience in recent years?
Sure. Well, I will say in some ways we completely depended on it, especially in the early parts of the pandemic. We were doing basically what we're doing right now, and our instructors had to move their entire courses to an online format. And so, and of course, very little preparation for that. Certain courses, lecture-based courses, probably were easier to pull that off on. But certainly, if you think about a lab course, that's a lot more difficult to do that. So I certainly think, certainly out of necessity, the education and the format has changed pretty substantially. Certainly, I think what I've learned as I observed is, and in some ways comfort to me, and I'll explain that in a moment, but is that students did not prefer, in many cases, the online learning format, that they want to be in person. And I'm happy to see that we're able to, it looks like, to transition back to that. And it's comforting to me because as somebody who tries to keep up to date, of course, on what's going on in higher ed, I was curious about the online colleges, and even Penn State has its own online campus. Were we really going to see that take over as the primary method of higher education? And actually, I think that the last 2 years have reaffirmed that no, I don't, at least unless there's a shift in the students' desire, it seems like many really didn't appreciate this aspect, the online aspect of learning. And I think a lot of it's about accountability. And for those of you who do have high school age children, I'm sure I have nothing but sympathy for them, but I imagine it was difficult to sit in front of a computer screen for hours on end, and I'm sure their quality of their education wasn't as good, just too easy to get distracted. And so I think that, but certainly technology, and to maybe circle back, it has been, I guess, a lifeline maybe for us in a lot of ways. But and I'm looking forward to the future and what is that right blend, because I think certainly we've learned that there are some ways of maybe instruction that is better or at least equal to, because of technology. At the same time, we also know the importance, I've learned the importance of that in-person experience for many students anyway.
So the hybrid advancement is going to come even quicker, and we'll see how that develops, huh?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay. So for people that will view this and have children going to college, can you highlight for a few minutes the role that they might have in their students' experience while at college? What opportunities do they have for interaction and for support?
Sure. And I think there's really kind of, as I think about this a little bit, there's probably two ways of viewing it. So there's certainly the one aspect of really just being the emotional support for the student as they go through their ups and downs. And I think I guess I should really highlight that I think in the end, your role as a parent is going to be what you and your student choose for it to be. I think you can be as involved or not as involved as you both collectively choose. So but I guess there's the emotional, if you will, support side, and then there's the administrative, financial aspect of parent support. On the emotional and side, I think that it really is going to just depend on what you both are looking for in terms of just that experience. Of course, I think there's going to be other aspects like how far away your student's going to be. Like here at Penn State York, we work with a lot of students who are living at home, so parents are likely going to be much more involved in the student's day-to-day life, versus a student who's living across the country where they may only see each other a couple times a year, maybe longer over the summer. So again, I think just first of all, I think it's going to depend, but deciding kind of what role you want. On the financial side, it certainly is also going to depend. Although I will say that from my own career experience, that some of the most heartbreaking situations I've run into is where students aren't being supported by their family financially. And I think that's important to understand, because if you look at most of the way that most colleges, not all, but vast majority, calculate students' financial aid packages or financial aid awards, most of those packages are based around the assumption that a student's going to have family support. And especially in a situation where a family does have substantial income, but yet the student's getting no support, the odds of that student is going to get a really good financial aid package in terms of grants and scholarships is really reduced. And so really that student's at quite a disadvantage. And so I certainly think that helping a student and understanding that, unfortunately, maybe it used to be true that at 18 you could go, but I don't know if that's really the case financially speaking either. Certainly, I also appreciate that there's many families, or families have different ability to help, and I think that's understood too. But I think just saying that no, we're not going to help is a difficult place to put a student, honestly, in my view, and from what I've seen, that really can set them up for either failure or just a very difficult role where they're probably going to have to take on substantial debt that may not be a benefit to their longer term future.
Okay, Ron. Interestingly, your comments and answer here raised two thoughts on my perspective. One, at the outset, if you have a child going to college, it's probably worth having a talk with that child about your role when they're there and how you interact and provide that support. I know that my wife and I try to be diligent about calling our daughter when she's in school to get updates. So I'm reasonably aware of what she's doing, at least insofar as she'll tell me on the weekdays. And now that she's 21, I can get more detail on the weekend since it's all legal too. So that conversation is good. And I often talk with my clients about that, even when it comes to planning. You need to sit down, you need to have a talk, you need to establish an understanding so you can be supportive of each other in your choices. So that's one part. The other part that struck me was the idea, and this is something that I've tried to inform people about, or perhaps remind them, is that once your child is 18, they are legally an adult, which means they stand on their own. But to your point, from a financial aid perspective at the college level, their relationship to you as a child still matters because that will be viewed. So they can't simply be viewed as being unsupported if they have parents. So two thoughts that came to mind with that answer. Moving on to the next question, Ryan. Do parents need permission to get involved with their kids' school?
Yes, they do. At least again, going back to that administrative and financial side. Yes, the law looks at them, and many a student, as once they're 18 or in college, that they're an adult to some extent, and that's where we do have kind of a challenging system, and I'd be the first to appreciate that. And thank you, Jeff. I think you were sharing, and I thought for this particular item, I did want to spend just 2 or 3 minutes highlighting kind of what the parents' role in college, and maybe to do that, also to share kind of what the colleges have to abide by. And there's something that really dictates a lot of what we can share to parents and families, and this particular law or legislation is called the FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. So very, very basics of it is it's a federal law that protects the privacy of student records. And this is actually true of a student under the age of 18 as well. But what happens when a student turns 18 is really a lot of the rights, if you will, transfer to that student's record, transfers from the parent to the student. And so or when they enter post-secondary education at any age. Now, this doesn't include students who are dual enrolled. Maybe they're still in high school, but they're taking a college class. We're talking about a student who's fully enrolled in college and made that transition. So there are a number of items that are protected information that a parent just can't go and get, probably being a couple of the big ones being grades, course listing, schedule, disciplinary records, and also the student's financial records as well. And so we can't just release that information if a parent calls, and I probably work more with parents than I do with students in many cases, unless there's been specific permission granted by the student that I can release this information. I cannot do that, and we need that student's permission. And so so going back to kind of what I said earlier, it's really important that you as parents have a conversation with your students about your role, and particularly your role in some of this information as well. So, I guess that's really my advice is, again, what role do you want to play, and what role does your student want you to play? And I think that's a conversation you should have before they go off college. The other aspect of this is you do have some control, I think, and you should set expectations with your student about those roles. And so what I mean by this is, again, I'm going to go back to when I was a student, and my parents were pretty clear. They were going to help me pay for tuition, which I was thankful for, but they also were going to see the grades every semester. And I think that's a pretty safe rule. It was a very good rule. It was certainly motivation for me to continue to make sure that I was doing pretty well. And they also were able to check in and make sure I wasn't taking all basket weaving courses or something like that, which I'm not sure that we offer, by the way, at Penn State. But point is that I think it gives you an ability to check in. With that said, this is an opportunity for you, and I encourage you to really give it up, let your student grow. And that transition does need to occur, and certainly something that we've seen, and going maybe back to kind of some of the changes we've seen in the last few years, is just the role of parents with their students. And I've heard of cases where parents have showed up to employer interviews and items like that, and kind of the picture at the bottom there highlights that a little bit. And so, I think that I don't think you do your student any favor, in my opinion, by being that involved and calling grad schools and employers when the student maybe doesn't get the job or doesn't get into that graduate school. I think it's maybe, my opinion, and take it for what it's worth, probably a little bit more involved. Again, as I also look at a student's experience in college as one of growth, and it is a time for them to make mistakes, hopefully not too many, but make mistakes and grow and learn. Obviously, you're going to be there as a safety net, as a good college also should be. But I also encourage, again, that you have that fine balance. And I think every case is different depending on your student, depending on your circumstances as well. But kind of one other item I wanted to add, and I can't really speak directly for other colleges outside of Penn State, but there are ways to grant for a student to grant access to certain aspects of their educational record, such as grades and access to the tuition and their financial aid and that type of thing. Penn State does have a process for that, which we go through over orientation. And so again, but that's something that when the student would need to take the initiative on to grant that access to you, should that be a route that you as a family choose to go. And so I think that's really kind of my last slide, other than a couple of references just for where I really gathered a lot of this information. But just be aware too that the colleges are bound again, and there's much information, a lot of information we directly can't share with parents once they're enrolled.
Thank you for that good explanation, Ryan. I recall signing some forms the first years that my children went to college, although I feel like I signed less forms over the years because it became less prevalent an issue for me. So I think there's a lesson there, which is ask your college age student about those access forms, or set an arrangement like you did, which is I want to see grades if I'm providing support to pay for your college experience. I do know one thing that I've been doing a lot more recently, Ryan, is actually helping young adults, meaning 18 years and older, um, by placing powers of attorney and healthcare powers of attorney into effect. The powers of attorney can grant the power to somebody else, which would be an agent, access to financial information. So I often have students grant that power to their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And then I do the same thing on the healthcare front with the healthcare power of attorney and living will. And while I know that many people don't march into college to look at grades using a power of attorney, I do believe that a power of attorney is a sufficient legal document to allow access to that information. And the one nice thing about a power of attorney is it doesn't go away with time and has to be revoked, which means that if you do it once when your child enters school, it would stay in place for all 4 years or however long. Although I do believe many of the forms that are signed at the university level are good for maybe a school year or have some sort of duration. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, and again, it's really just when I think about the forms that at least I have in mind for Penn State, yeah, it's actually believe that they would be good until the student would revoke the access. But that, again, it's only related to the university relationship with the student and the parent, not kind of beyond that, really.
Okay. Have you seen examples of student-related issues without divulging any names where those permissions or documents weren't in place?
Sure. I mean, it happens fairly regularly where, again, in a lot of cases, parents are taking the lead on the financial matters of the student's role in college or their status, and but then they tend to run into a roadblock because we can't always share information about either for example, maybe a student has lost financial aid eligibility. There's a number of ways that can occur, but one way that can occur is if they're not completing courses in a set amount of time. Maybe they failed, maybe they withdrew. That's not information we can readily share without permission under FERPA. So that happens very regularly. And there are many other examples as well. But that scenario is one that happens pretty often. And so it kind of ties our hand. We can talk about policies generally, but we can't say, well, yeah, your student failed 3 courses and this is why they lost their scholarship or something like that. So.
Interesting. So I'm sitting in a law office and you're at the university, but I feel like we have the same theme, which is have a discussion with your loved ones in advance to establish understandings, mm-hmm. and then get the right documents in place so that you can support them when they need it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Great. So given your extensive experience, even though you graduated from college relatively recently, in my opinion, Ryan, could you offer some practical advice to someone whose child is looking at college, some advice with regard to admissions? So any thoughts you would offer anyone viewing the video on admissions and insight on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of advice I can offer, which I also recognize would have been challenging a year or two ago, is certainly to visit the colleges, especially if your student's not entirely sure of where they want to go. And a visit can come in many different forms. It can be, of course, a formal college visit, which we pretty much all will offer regularly. But for me, as I mentioned in my introduction, I was a pretty active volleyball player in high school. And so that was actually a unique opportunity because I got to go and travel to different colleges as well and play in their gyms as part of a tournament or something like that. So I'd say that however that works for you and your family, I definitely encourage visiting to different colleges. Maybe you want to look at again, I think you have to know your student, or at least know what they're thinking about in terms of how far away from home. Typically, students, usually the average is around 2 hours away if they're going to move away anyway, and they tend to not run across the country, although some certainly do, and then of course some stay local as well. So I think that first and foremost, just kind of, and I would say, and maybe within that timeline, the junior year in high school is a good time to do those visits. Maybe into the kind of the summer between the junior year and senior year is also a good time, because that's also a chance you'll usually get an admissions presentation where they'll highlight that process um, for the coming year as they're getting ready to apply as seniors. I guess the other piece of advice beyond just kind of that visit and the importance of that is the importance of deadlines, and that's true both in the admission space but also in the financial aid space. And if a college has a recommended deadline or a preferred deadline or early action deadline, there's a lot of different terms out there. But if they're throwing out a date and they say you should apply by then, you probably should, and that's probably going to give your student the best chance for admission to the college they want, the major they want. Also, in many cases, will put them in the best situation for financial aid scholarships. There is a lot of different terms, that kind of early action, early decision, that kind of are thrown around in admissions spaces, and every college does that differently. So again, it's worth going and visiting the colleges that your student may be interested in fairly early on, just to have an understanding of their process. They're usually pretty open about that, but you definitely want to have that information.
Interesting. So visit early and get those visits in. And I learned firsthand that waiting too long makes it tough to squeeze the visits in. Another thing that it sounds like would be helpful to me is to try to build some relationship at the university level, if that's where you want to go, so you can build some support and advocacy for your admission and getting in.
Yeah, and that certainly depends a bit. Colleges utilize, like many of us do, different CRMs, so they're able to track, has that student visited, has that student emailed and interacted with us, has that family. So we are able to track things like demonstrated interest, which many colleges will use as a factor in their admissions decision.
Okay. Okay, and you alluded a moment ago to deadlines with regard to scholarships, but is there any other advice you would offer relative to seeking financial aid or scholarships for a college-bound child?
Well, again, I think I've got to re-highlight the importance of the family's role. So if the most colleges in the country, and any college receiving federal financial aid, the way that that's determined is by completing what's called a free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA form. That's a form that analyzes both the student financial information and, honestly, in most cases, more importantly, the parents' financial information. And that's how colleges will really develop a financial aid package for students. Now, this doesn't tend to get into merit awarding, but certainly for any type of financial need awarding. So a family that is, unfortunately, even many of us would consider, that middle of the road, middle income family, in most cases, that student's probably not going to get a whole lot in I'll call grant aid, that tends to go to students who are of higher need. So again, just understanding that a student who's kind of in a middle income family is going to need probably some financial support, unless they are in a special situation, or a phenomenal athlete, or merit, those kinds of things. And I think just appreciating that there probably is going to be, almost definitely for most of us, a role to play in our children's financial aspect of college.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So you're part of the Penn State University system. Can you tell us one thing that people may not know about Penn State York?
Sure. First of all, that we do have a campus in York. I'm always surprised that we meet people all the time who said, "Oh, I've never been there," or "There's a campus in York." And yes, there is. I think maybe to our disadvantage slightly is just we're kind of tucked away a little bit, so we're not on a main throughway. With that said, we're only about a mile from York Hospital, so we're really not that far out either. Just I think that that we're here. We have a beautiful campus as well, and love to invite anybody who's never been to come on a campus tour, show you around the campus. Also, a little plug, if your student is considering Penn State and they come on a campus tour, we'll happy to waive their application fee, even if they're not necessarily considering Penn State York. Any Penn State location, that application fee waiver would be valid.
Excellent. And from personal knowledge, I also know some unique features about Penn State York. One would include the Polo Center, which is an extraordinary performing arts facility that's unique, largely to this campus, and it's a great place in our community. And then also the Graham Center.
Yep. You can kind of see it if your camera's good or your screen's good. The Graham Center is right behind me. In fact, it's our newest building that went online just a little over a year ago, housing, which is a unique program to Penn State, the Graham Fellows Program for Entrepreneurial Leadership, which is a supplemental program to any student's degree. So it's an add-on, if you will, where Mr. Graham's vision really is to provide students the soft skills that are needed to be successful when they enter the workforce. So that's accomplished through a variety of workshops, dining etiquette, related programs, and such. And so we invite students to also be a part of that if they attend Penn State York, and could be a really good add-on, and also a nice network for additional internship and career opportunities down the line for them.
Outstanding. Well, Ron, you provided a lot of terrific information today, and I appreciate it very much. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we finish up with our session?
I think you asked great questions, Jeff, and I'm happy if there are any questions to stay on for a minute or two as well to answer anything else. But otherwise, I just want to thank you for the opportunity and thank our attendees now or in the future for their time.
All right, Ron. Well, thank you very much. This video will be available, and as we talked about, we're going to share this information. So I appreciate your preparation, information, and time. You're a credit to Penn State York, and our community. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.